The rain taught him first. Jiraiya let him sit in it until the chill entered bone, until the village circle of aim blurred and sharpened behind curtains of water that smelled like tin, until each drop felt like a note plucked on a string he hadn't known was there. "Stop looking," the old man had said, amused and stern, pointing at Naruto's chest. "Listen." It was not chakra. He knew chakra. The river he could dam and flood by breath and hand sign. This was will given sense. When he stood, the entire alleyway snapped into a grid of intent. The shopkeeper behind the paper wall weighed whether to scold a stray cat. The shinobi 2 roofs away itched to kill. The drop that would break when it hit his eyelash was already broken in his mind. Jiraiya taught him to name this listening. Observation Haki. He taught him another trick as they walked the long bridges through steam and steel. How to harden that will until it became a skin over skin, a lacquer that could coat a fist, a kunai, a frog-summoned staff, even the wind of a Rasengan itself if he could keep his heart steady. Armament Haki. And the last dangerous thing, taught in the woodlands where cicadas screamed like blades. How to let the whole world feel what he felt and force it to agree. A king's pressure that made the weak kneel and the unwilling blink and sweat. That could make Jinin faint and crows detonate in the sky. A shockwave without hand signs. Conqueror's Haki. Jiraiya's warning cut between them like a shuriken. The cost would not be in bruises. Will burned. If he pushed too far, the channels of his spirit would scorch. The senses that made this possible would blur, and tremors would live in his hands afterward, like aftershocks of an earthquake. He would be less for a while, and if he kept doing it, those scars would not entirely fade. "You don't flex your heart without tearing something," the old man said, and Naruto nodded because the rain had said it first. He returned to Konoha, carrying quiet where noise used to be. The village felt louder for his new listening. The hum of gossip, the scrape of politics, the ghost weight of memorials. Sakura laughed, and then became a precise zone of warmth in his senses. Kakashi, reading as ever, was a boulder on a riverbed. Water went around him because he willed it so. They welcomed him with noodles and a test. On Training Ground 3, he moved as though someone else had drawn lines on the grass for his feet. Kakashi's bell trick became a sketch Naruto could ink. Shadows thickened, a substitution mark bloomed. Naruto pivoted 2 breaths before the attack because he felt the decision form in Kakashi's shoulder. He slid under a wind blade, coated his forearm with armament haki, and the blade split around him like shallow surf around a piling. He struck a log and left a fingerprint burned into bark that smelled like black tea. Then he pulsed, not with malice, but with a flare of refusal, and squirrels fled the trees while Sakura's knees buckled an inch she refused to show. Conquerors restrained, a line drawn and not crossed. Kakashi's eye crinkled above the mask. "You learned something with no hand signs," he said. Simple and dangerous. And Naruto grinned because it felt like being seen without being captured. Consequences. Scoreboard. Naruto returned stronger without becoming alien. Injuries? None. But Sakura's pride was bruised and delighted. Politics. Elders took note. An unnamed report folder grew a second paperclip. Public mood. The ramen shop would be full tonight. Territory. Training Ground 3. Learned a new smell. Char and peppermint wind. Word traveled the way sparks do in dry grass, and elsewhere, behind a wooden wind chime that never moved, a man in a dark cloak with the red clouds of a storm not yet spent listened. In a Megacore's high tower, Nagato's thin fingers rested on the black metal of the Six Paths throne. He watched through God Realm eyes, what reports could not carry. Shivers of will that dented the air in Konoha. The boy had grown teeth, not of chakra, but of spirit. A force that did not rout through the Biju at all. Pain's plan lived on a white slate. Destabilize. Isolate. Extract. Convert grief to order. He adjusted one line with a thought as cold as rain. Konoha's extraction would happen with spectacle. Break the village openly to break the boy's certainty. The gods prefer obedience, born of witnessed ruin. Gaara was kidnapped by men who wore their faith as scars. The desert's wind huffed like an old bellows as Team Kakashi and Team Guy moved like twin blades toward the cave where puppets slept. Inside, the air tasted like old blood and camphor. Deidara's bombs came on the breath, clay birds turning elegant arcs. Naruto could feel a whisper ahead of time. He spat curse and laughter and sayonara, and the cave's roof shuddered with edits to reality. Naruto's body moved along the ghost lines his observation painted. He caught a bird that was meant to fake left and kill right, coated his hand, and crushed it into a harmless poof with armament. He threw a Rasengan and wrapped it in will until it became a spinning black bead with a white eye. Chakra armored, weight multiplied, space squealing around it. Sasori's threads tried to read his limbs, but found no easy mathematics. When Deidara tried to break morale with a sculpted massacre, Naruto's patience snapped like a dry twig. The cave's air condensed as his Conqueror's Haki rippled out, just enough, a reel-in rather than a cast, weakening puppet's rhythm, making clay chirp go flat. Granny Chio's hands moved like an old prayer restored. Gaara's chest rose because lives were put back into place by more than medicine. Consequences scoreboard. Gaara lived, but carved a new scar into his calm. Chio left hers in the earth forever. Injuries. Naruto's knuckles cracked. The tremor afterward told him he had flirted with the cost. Politics. Suna's debt to Konoha deepened, and the Akatsuki marked a name with brighter ink. Public mood. Hope in Suna tasted like warm dust after rain. Territory. The cave fell on itself. The desert swallowed shame and triumph alike. Time thickened into training and missions that carved a groove of competence into the days. Asuma smoked less and smiled more, and then bled red on gray ground while Haiden thanked a god made of absence. Naruto listened to the long echo of that scream. It filled his ribs. He learned a new Rasengan variant, how to put wind inside wind, until the edges cut the idea of cutting. Meanwhile, the will tricks became less trick and more muscle. He learned to put observation into a coin toss and watch the future choose. He learned to sheath a headbutt in armament and hear an enemy mask ring like a bell. He learned to let conquerors roll like far thunder across a battlefield, to make 100 feet hesitate for a breath he could fill with his own feet. The tremors came as little reminders, teacup rattling on wood, sometimes a gray smear at the edge of his sight when he pushed too far. He learned restraint, not from sermons, but from pain. Midpoint found him in the flea-bitten outskirts, where Kakuzu wore his arrogance like armor. The air there was wet dirt and iron, and the ground was a web of traps drawn by a miserly artist. Kakuzu's mouths were wrong on a body like that. The extra hearts moved in a rhythm that made Naruto's observation hum with error. They came fast. Lightning speared, wind scythed, fire licked. Naruto felt each choice the moment it hardened in Kakuzu's shoulders and elbows and toes, a slow blink universe where he could walk in between decisions and pluck the ones he preferred to dance with. He took hits on armament, felt the shock carry through will instead of bone, and then he stepped into the type of focus that makes the world small and his breath a rope he could climb. Rasenshuriken formed, a scream of air that wanted to be a hurricane in his palm. Armament wrapped it until it held a shape that would not tear him apart. He saw not the move Kakuzu would make, but the breath Kakuzu would forget to take, and he slotted his attack there. When it landed, the sound was like a page tearing in a giant's book. Kakuzu's threads convulsed and then fell like hair in a fire. Haiden hissed and cursed, and failed to read the boy who did not move by piety. But when Naruto pushed Conquerors outward to drown Haiden's zeal long enough for Shikamaru's shadow to lock clean, the tremor afterward was not small. His fingers danced when he needed stillness, and a noise like ocean static nibbled at his hearing for the rest of that day. Consequences Scoreboard. Team 10 got justice and paid with innocence. Injuries. Naruto's spirit channels bore fresh scorch. 3 days of shakier handwriting followed. Politics. Konoha's reputation sharpened. Akatsuki's recruiting pool thinned as fear moved into their tents. Public mood. Funerals quieted. A harvest of relief gathered. Territory. A forest clearing learned the shape of a wind that slices ideas in half. There is a story whispered by toads and old men about the first time a shinobi looked at a tree and decided to climb it with nothing but will. Long before jutsu had names, people called it hunger. Chakra made what hunger asked for possible, put structure to appetite, made maps of breath and diagrams of intent. But beneath chakra is a sea. On that sea moves Haki, not a separate ocean, but the undercurrent, how spirit insists. In lands with open water, they learn to call it by a word that means leader and listener, both. In lands with mountains and villages built from agreements, they forgot it on purpose, so wars could be about techniques and bloodlines, rather than about who simply refused to fall. When Haki returns, it does not bring new gods, it brings old debts. It asks a question that embarrasses lineage. If power is a birthright in one tongue and a decision in another, which makes you flinch? Nagata watched the question become a boy with the sun in his hair and decided to answer with an eraser. Pain came to Konoha like weather. Clouds thick as iron hung low. The first blast was an argument that nobody could misunderstand. The village turned into a bowl of dust. People and memories and roofs spun into a gray halo around a god on a spike. Hell Realm breathed rot and truth. Animal Realm called monsters that dripped and chirped. Konoha's defense was brave and insufficient. Then Naruto fell from the sky on a toad's back, sage paint on his face. Haki fitted over his sternum like a second chest plate. The air itself looked relieved to see him. Fukasaku croaked strategy. Naruto's observation grabbed it and wrote it in calligraphy across the battlefield. The bamboo forest of intent rang. Each path's decision tree lit up. He flowed between summonings like water knowing where gravity lived. He coded a Rasengan until it was ink dark and hammered through Preta Realm's greedy grasp. Armament pushed it past absorption, will-beating appetite. Diva Realm's gravity trick pressed down. Naruto's breath seized, the taste of metal growing fat on his tongue. He didn't pulse Conquerors to brag. He sketched it across the battle's face, just enough to make the civilian heartbeats around him steady. To make a few panicking Chunin remember they had legs and years of training. He kept pressure tight so the cost would not take his hands away in the middle of this architecture of survival. In between, he did something small and beautiful. He spoke to villagers simply, and they listened. And in that exchange, his haki fattened without burning, because the will was shared rather than thrown. When the push-pull dance with Deva peaked, he let the cost bite. He cracked conquerors open like thunder close to the ear. Windows cried from a block away. Deva's steps miscounted by one. That one was the measure Naruto needed. He struck. The god bled. Then he traced the will line back to the man in the tower and went to talk to the source. He chose words over annihilation. Jiraiya had taught him that too. Consequences. Scoreboard. Konoha broke and then stood up, smaller and more honest. Injuries. Hundreds. Dead, mourned by name. Naruto's hands shook for a week, and his hearing fuzzed at the edges in quiet rooms. Politics. Elders lived, but their certainty died. The world recalculated Konoha's center of gravity. Public mood. Grief braided with gratitude. Territory. A crater became a square where children would someday race and tumble. On a ridge above a valley, he had been forced to leave once. Sasuke watched the sky over Konoha turn gray and then clear. His own heart was a blade he had put in a forge and refused to remove until it glowed white. Hatred is a craftsman when fed. He had expected Naruto to grow tall. He had not expected him to grow wide in this new way, as if the boy had discovered a language that did not care about the Uchiha diagram of power. The Conqueror's pulse that rolled across mountains felt like an argument against the clan's extinction being a fixed star. Sasuke changed his plan with the precision of a surgeon tilting a scalpel. Draw Naruto out to a place where eyes could be king and king killing could be clean. Build a Susanoo not merely as armor, but as an echo chamber to reflect will back on its owner. He would make the Valley of the End mean what he wanted this time, not what history demanded. Time marched, as time always does. Wearing disguises, recovery became conference, became brief, peace became the hardness that lives behind smiles. The 5K summit shattered into old grievances and newer weapons, and when it ended, snow outside the Iron Country temples recorded footsteps that refused to walk side by side. Naruto's Haki threaded him through assassination attempts and negotiations alike. He learned that observation was not omniscience. It caught choices, not accidents, and so he left space for the universe to surprise him and forgive him. He learned that armament could coat more than fist and wind. It could wrap a promise, make it heavier, make it break the ground when set down. He used Conquerors twice on purpose when he didn't want to. Once to stop a mob from tearing a missing nin apart with bare hands. Once to make a room of cage look at him rather than at each other with arithmetic in their eyes. And both times the tremor afterward went all the way up his arms and into his chest, where his heart climbed to meet it like a worried animal. He carried a teacup whenever he could now, because the little rattles were easier to love if they sang against porcelain. The war came, wearing a mask that said peace, broken for peace later. And Naruto ran toward it, because that is what he does. Army met army and made berms of bodies and bridges of bravery across chasms of stupidity. Clones spread like butter on toast to places his feet could never reach in time. 1,000 small uses of observation spared lives as he warned and nudged, as he turned a spear by looking at the wrist that held it a heartbeat too long. He learned to sheath his tailed chakra in armament so that his own power stopped flaying allies by accident. Kurama rolled in his ribcage and laughed for the first time in years, a sound like glaciers calving into warm seas. Conquerors he rationed like water in drought, And still the cost mounted, a ledger of static and shake, of mornings that began a degree dimmer than they should. He made peace with it the way a farmer makes peace with sunburn. Complain? Then keep working. The final duel waited exactly where it should, in stone and water and wind, carved into an argument two boys had memorized, down to the vowels. The Valley of the End. The statues watched with their wet eyes, snowmelt hurrying around their toes. The air was clean. It smelled like pine and a little like blood that hadn't yet happened. Conversation was short. "You never stop," Sasuke said. "No," Naruto said. That was enough. Wide shot. They closed the distance. Sasuke opened with speed that wrote slashes of white into the air. Naruto's observation brought time into a manageable size, each choice blooming in Sasuke's shoulders like flowers opening quickly and dying faster. He slid under a blade of lightning, felt the heat on his cheek, coded a counterpunch in armament that made the crack on Sasuke's jaw ring like tempered glass under stress. The Sharingan spun and then deepened into the cold cathedral of the Mangekyo. Amaterasu birthed black hunger. Naruto pushed armament over his cloak so the flames ate will and tasted nothing. Susanoo rose, a titan with a cathedral ribcage and anger for a face. Slow-mo. Naruto closed his eyes and listened not to Sasuke's heart, but to the intention trembling out of his bones. He found the moment Sasuke chose to take everything rather than enough. He spoke to it with a burst of conquerors that made the world flinch but did not force it to kneel. This wasn't about dominance, but about editing. Susanoo's arm faltered half a degree. Half a degree is the difference between a river that floods a village and one that waters fields. Naruto dove through the ribcage's shadow and planted a Rasengan, hardened with will, where the armor's plates met. The spin sang. The shell groaned. One rib shattered, and the air tasted like bone dust. Sasuke adapted like lightning, finding a new path. He used genjutsu not to confuse Naruto, but to waste his observation on ghosts. For a breath, Naruto's grid of intent filled with decoys so elegant even his new sense applauded. Pain flashed behind his left eye. The cost demanded a payment in attention. He paid. He leaned into something older than either technique. Trust. He let the genjutsu haze sit in his peripheral vision, like a pond he refused to look directly into, and followed the rhythm of Sasuke's breath. A feint became honest when it met someone who refused to lie to his own senses. The kunai that mattered came from the blind side that wasn't blind in Naruto's head. Armament met it. Sparks told a small story. They traded injuries. Naruto caught a slice along the ribs that made his breath whistle. Sasuke broke 2 fingers on his offhand when a block was a fraction too late. Kurama barked inside Naruto, a warning that sounded like love disguised as anger. They escalated. It became geography. Water churned into whirlpools and then into fists. Wind screamed into shapes. Lightning wrote cursive across the sky. Fire practiced being a god. Observation stretched thin and then sang again when Naruto found the seam in Sasuke's new pattern, the place where hatred didn't quite fit the hole it was supposed to fill. Conquerors rolled out one last time in a wave that made birds lift from pine boughs miles away. It didn't floor Sasuke. It didn't have to. It made him blink and remember a ramen steam he had once pretended to hate, and a boy with a frog wallet and a promise like a rope thrown across an abyss. That memory wobbled the blade by the width of a tear. Naruto slid inside it, took the slash on his armament-coated forearms, and stepped so close he could smell snow in Sasuke's hair. He set the Rasengan against armor that was eyes and bones and grief and pressed. The world decided to allow it. The spin bloomed and then finished its sentence. Susanoo shattered like stained glass in a sermon gone wrong. Both boys fell, because that is the shape the story needs at this point. The river caught them. The statues watched like patient ghosts. They lay there a while. Naruto's hands did not obey when he asked them to stay still. The tremors tapped out a Morse code the water pretended not to hear. Sasuke stared at a sky that refused to be a mirror and felt tired in a way sleep couldn't cure. "You're a fool," he said, honest. "I'll keep being one," Naruto said, because the village needed that sentence to be true, or else too many graves would be busy next spring. He didn't force anything more. He didn't press conquerors to win a conversation. He let the weight of armament fall away and trusted observation to tell him if a last knife was coming. It didn't. Consequences scoreboard. The valley took another story into its stone. Neither statue smiled. Injuries. Both boys would carry new scars. Naruto's tremors, now a part of how he would hold chopsticks forever. Sasuke's left shoulder, never quite right in the rain. Politics. A path back opened like a reluctant door. The war's math shifted because a single friendship didn't die. Public mood. Konoha slept a little deeper. The world watched and pretended not to hope. Territory. The river's edge moved 2 feet where the Rasengan kissed it. Future children would find smooth stones there and wonder why. In the days after, Naruto walked slower. He spoke to villagers and let them speak back. He trained in ways that did not grind. He learned that will could be grown like a tree rather than lit like a fuse. He mapped the scars inside and found them not as ruins, but as a new city he could live in if he learned where the intersections were. He visited graves and listened until the silence gave something back that felt like permission. He did not stop using Haki. He changed why. The observation became mostly for people he loved, so he could arrive at their hurts half a breath before they became wounds. Armament became a way to hold things, ropes, doors, promises, so they did not slip. Conquerors sat where kings keep their last sword, sheathed not from fear, but from clarity about what it does to the body that swings it. Far away, a man on a prow tasted a wind that had crossed 1,000 miles of nothing and everything. He smiled because he recognized, beneath salt and storm, a pressure that said a king was training inland. He did not turn his ship yet. Instead, he flicked a Denden Mushi awake and told an old story a new name. In Konoha, a boy with sun in his hair opened a letter from a village on the coast, asking for help with pirates who didn't use chakra, only will and weather and knives. And he laughed because the world had just grown one size bigger without asking anyone's permission. He folded the letter, tucked it into his frog wallet, and went to tell his friends. The ramen shop's door chimed. The tremor in his hand was there when he reached for the bowl. A small taxi paid with eyes open. He ate and smiled because the bill was fair and because the next meal would be bigger. The mission brief was a napkin between his fingers, the ink bleeding where steam kissed it. By the time Naruto finished his bowl, he had memorized the coordinates and the tone of the hand that had written them. Practical desperation, not theater. He walked to the edge of the village with his hands in his pockets because it was evening and he wanted to look like someone going for a stroll. Sakura caught up without asking whether she was invited, the set of her jaw saying she knew when to refuse orders that got in the way of what was obvious. Kakashi drifted along a half step behind like a thought one hasn't finished thinking yet. Book unopened. eye watching the world the way a cat watches rain. They moved through fields that once held tents and now held weeds. The path down to the coast was a rib of dirt that pretended not to remember the weight of war boots. The air changed to salt and pine. The horizon flattened into a steel plate with sunlight skittering across it like thrown shuriken. The harbor town smelled like fish and tar and worry. Ropes frayed where knives had bitten them. Shutters opened only as wide as fear allowed. An old man on the wharf looked at Naruto's forehead protector, and then passed it to the tremor he hid poorly. The man nodded in the tiny way people nod when they decide to move some of their own will into someone else's hands for a while. Cutaway. In the tavern, mugs clicked on wood with the subdued rhythm of a place pretending everything ordinary had not recently been dented by something new. The first pirate announced himself not with a flag, but with silence. Gulls along the roofline threw themselves into the air at once, as if a hand had pressed down on all their necks. Naruto felt it as a pressure change. A low ceiling of Conqueror's Haki rolled across the dock like fog. 3 sailors folded like knives shut. A child grabbed at a doorframe with both hands and held on by choice and fingernails. Naruto's observation sketched the approaching rhythm. 4 men and a woman in oilskins and confidence. Steps placed with sea legs' casual precision. The one in front was a clear, bright shape of decision-making, the kind of mind that did not wait for permission. He didn't draw a kunai first. He stepped into the air of that pressure with his own, and laid a counter-hum across it. Not a shout, but a steady tone that pulled breathing back into throats and set cups on tables instead of floors. The pirate captain, a man with hair like stormweed and eyes that weighed rooms, paused the way a wolf pauses when the wind brings news of a larger animal. "So the leaf grows near the ocean now," he said, accent old water. Naruto let the tremor in his hand go unanswered and turned his palm up, empty. "We don't like people making others kneel," he said, and the captain smiled, because there was very little to argue with in that. They moved without a signal. Naruto felt the woman on the left decide to shoot at a bolt he couldn't see yet. The moment of choice, a nickel taste on his tongue, and he moved a heartbeat sideways so the bolt rode a line through empty air, then snapped his forearm into it with armament humming just enough to turn metal into an embarrassed ricochet. Sakura was already forward, steps clean, arms a geometry problem the world had to solve or concede. A pirate swung an iron hook and found his wrist held where it lived, and then persuaded to sleep. Kakashi slipped past the captain, like a rumor, and tested the others with feints that carried no chakra and much intent. He watched their feet decide and learned what they had learned. Observation light at first, enough to catch a clumsy lie. Naruto didn't escalate because people were watching with the kind of eyes that remember too well. He painted conquerors in a narrow band that cut off the captain's ability to push his men into overconfidence without having to pour a tide into civilians. The captain understood immediately and changed tactics, which told Naruto 2 important things. This wasn't their first village, and their leader wasn't in love with a single script. Armament flickered on the edge of the captain's fist like oil catching light. The punch that came had weight beyond muscle, a tide in a teacup. Naruto met it with his own coding and felt, for a spark, the odd joy of 2 wills acknowledging each other in the oldest language, refusal. The boards beneath them groaned where their argument met, tar spitting like vowels, and the shock ran up Naruto's bones into the place the tremor made a home. He accepted the cost's small bite, rather than push conquerors wider. He would pay with a messier chopstick grip, rather than with half the dock asleep. The fight wrote clear sentences. The pirates had drills for fighting people who used tricks. They kept spacing. They didn't flinch when kunai cut their coats. They understood that much of battle is about not believing the first story your eyes tell. Naruto adjusted, trusted observation to catch the second story instead. He drifted to the edge to draw pressure away from the knots of townsfolk. The captain obliged, stepping into open plank with a grin that broke into teeth at the corners. Name? He asked, because some rituals travel across cultures. Naruto, he said, because hiding would only make the next visit worse. The captain tasted it, then gave his own like a man throwing a coin into a well. Ishiro. Slow-mo. Ishiro's shoulders bunched late. His choice happened first in the left hip, and in the eyes of the man behind him, who looked where he planned to move. Naruto filled that gap with a twist and a palm that met ribs with the polite indifference of armament over kindness. Ishiro slid, caught himself, smiled like someone remembering a joke from childhood. He switched to a blade that didn't exist a second before. Will hardened into edge. His armament a lacquer that made a dull knife dangerous. Naruto tensed the air around his own hand until it felt like stone wrapped around wind, then drew a circle that met Ishiro's line at a right angle. Sparks fell into the sea and hissed like gossip. It ended without drama, because villages don't need opera. Naruto stepped in on a beat he had made for himself, just after Ishiro glanced at the woman on his left, to check whether she'd recovered, just before the man on his right could decide to charge and die, and put a Rasengan against Ishiro's coat, and then covered it in armament, so that when it spun, it bruised will rather than shattered bone. Ishiro's body understood he had been defeated before his pride did. He went to a knee with dignity and spat into the water rather than onto the dock. Naruto backed his pressure off gently and let the town's air stand up on its own. He looked at Ishiro and did not ask questions in public. "Come back with a flag if you want to talk," he said. Ishiro's eyes promised both violence and conversation in some order yet to be determined. Then he rolled to his feet and signaled the retreat with a whistle that bent the gull's flight for a heartbeat. The pirates leapt for skiffs that moved as if pulled by invisible hands. Sails caught wind with the sound of doors opening and closing. Naruto listened until their haki blurred into the larger static of the ocean, and then exhaled a breath he had kept on a shelf during the entire exchange. Consequences Scoreboard. Harbor secured without blood on planks. Ishiro's crew left intact but impressed, which is its own weapon. Injuries. Bruised ribs for one sailor, a sprained wrist for Sakura's hook friend. Naruto's tremor louder tonight. A strand of static crawling against his ear like a fly he would swat at nothing. Politics. The coast now knows Konoha will come when called, and the new class of enemy knows the leaf can speak will to will. Public mood. Relief like a tide falling. Pride returning shyly. Territory. Ropes retied. A tavern's door rehung. A dock board replaced, where two leaders argued, and the wood took notes. Night leaned in with the sound of rigging talking to wind. Lanterns lit a constellation, low to the water. Naruto sat on the edge of the dock with his feet dangling over black, the boards still holding the echo of the afternoon's debate. Sakura wrapped his right hand between both of hers and stared at fingernails gone white with pressure. "You're shaking more," she said, not accusing. He didn't sigh because he'd learned to save air for useful things. "I chose not to shout," he said. "Sometimes whispering your will costs more because you hold it tighter." She nodded like someone who had carried too heavy a bag home rather than dropping it and watching the fruit bruise. Kakashi sat with them long enough for the night to outline his shoulder, then drifted off like a thought finished. The old man from the wharf brought them tea that tasted like someone had washed a pine cone and decided to drink the water. Naruto drank it because it was hot and because it made his hands less interesting to watch. Morning brought repairs and rumors, and a boy with a scar on his chin practicing standing up after a push of conquerors like a game rather than a punishment. Naruto liked that better than almost anything. He watched men who had been fishermen yesterday teach each other how to look around corners with their bodies instead of just their eyes. He watched women tie knots with a confidence that had nothing to do with pirates and everything to do with choosing not to be surprised again. He taught nothing explicitly and learned everything because the ocean has a way of saying the same thing as the mountains in a different voice. When the time came to leave, he didn't make speeches. He set his hand, still buzzing, on the old man's shoulder and let armament slide into the touch, so it felt like a blessing that would be felt for a day or two in the joints when the weather changed. The old man blinked fast and then held his chin too high for a second, which was the right way to spend gratitude. On the climb back, the path gave them sky, and then trees, and then the familiar geometry of Konoha's walls. Naruto felt the village notice him with a warmth that had nothing to do with acclaim. It was the particular pride a place takes when one of its loudest children learns to be quiet without becoming small. He checked on the square that used to be a crater. Vendors had put their carts where the ground remembered implosion, and children hopped from the darker stone to the lighter in a game with the rules they'd invented that morning. He breathed in and kept it. Sakura peeled off with a wave and a reminder about sleep disguised as a joke about ramen. Kakashi vanished in a puff of nonchalance that would, in a different universe, have had a theme song. Naruto walked to the memorial without thinking he was doing something noble. Names read themselves into him and did not hurt as sharply as before, which scared him and comforted him in equal measure. He spoke to Jiraiya without moving his mouth and felt for a moment the amphibious patience of someone who had taught a boy to listen to rain. Later, when the sun was a coin lost in cloud and the village was the particular kind of busy that looks like rest because no one is running, he found himself on the Hokage monument's nose, legs swinging out over a drop that the body never entirely makes friends with. He looked toward the ocean and let observation stretch thin until it felt like a net cast too wide, then reeled it in to keep the cost from asking for more fingers than he could give. Somewhere far away, a pressure line rolled, a king's hum from another world, Olda's stories sung on deck planks, and he smiled without fear because there are few honest joys, like recognizing that the world is larger and you have enough hands to carry only part of it. He stood, the tremor turning the word stand into a verb the whole body participated in, and went to find Ichiraku again because sea air makes soup taste better, and because the future always talks louder on a full stomach. The stinger arrived not as a letter this time, but as a merchant with tales of sails that moved against the wind, and of a woman who walked on air above waves, and Naruto laughed into his bowl, because destiny had finally learned his preferred delivery method, stories with enough room for a promise. The merchant's story followed him into sleep, and turned into a coastline in his head. When morning climbed through the curtains and put light on the floorboards like a map, he traced it with his toe, and smiled because the path looked like something he could run. The summons came not from the elders this time, but from a name that still pulled his mouth into a crooked grin. Tazuna. With an ink-stained thumbprint under a hastily drawn seal, asking for eyes on the Great Naruto Bridge because sails he did not recognize had been tasting its wind. He folded the request into his pocket the way a man tucks a charm near his ribs and left word for Sakura with one of the clinic's kids, who took messages more seriously than most. Shinobi took their own schedules. By noon, he was on the road, lungs remembering the early days when this path had taught him what a promise felt like, when it dragged heavier than expected. The river's voice grew louder until it became a crowd, the bridge's stone announcing itself with a confidence that felt earned rather than inherited. Tazuna stood at the rail like a man in love with an idea he had helped to make real. His beard was whiter, and his eyes were the same kind of stubborn. "She creaks when the wind turns," Tazuna said without hello, palm on the stone as if feeling for a fever. Naruto pressed observation out and felt it catch on the sharp, precise intentions of people who had learned to walk on decks that move. Spacings, checks, the absence of wasted steps. The sails on the horizon were low and dark, not showy. Function had chosen cloth over flags. He did not tell Tazuna to evacuate because he heard in the builder's bones that leaving would break something in him in a way no repair could fix. He did, however, move children towards market stalls, with roofs that would not become knives if they fell. He sent a Chunin runner along the span, with a smile that said, honestly, "This is probably fine, and also, please move like someone who knows how to look." They arrived with no banners and no music. The gulls rose and circled and shut up all at once, which had become a kind of drumroll in this new era. Skiffs cut wakes that looked like sentences, punctuation crisp, and no run-ons. Hooked poles nudged them perfectly into the bridge's shadow. The woman who walked on air did not walk immediately. She waited until the hush had stacked 4 breaths high, and then put her foot down on nothing, as if testing a stair only she could see. She came up level with Naruto without ever letting the water touch her boots. Her hair was the color of old rope left in sun. Her eyes were the quick gray of a storm deciding. The pressure that rolled off her was not a push at first. It was a question. Who decides here? Naruto answered with presence rather than volume. He tuned his Conqueror small and specific, and laid it along the spine of the bridge so stone and people felt steadier, and the air had less work to do. She nodded because someone who had learned to walk on air appreciates good footing. "Ko," she said, offering the name like a tool rather than a threat. "Naruto," he said, and the bridge seemed privately pleased by the symmetry of 2 names on its back. Her crew fanned, silent. Men and women with will lacquered not as a uniform, but as a habit. They kept distance that would ruin an ambush and make a battle honest. Naruto liked them more for that. Wide shot. For a moment, everything balanced. The river drawing a straight line under a straight span, breath shawls fluttering on market stalls, Tazuna's hand tight on stone, the low murmur of men in boats who had decided long ago they would not die for a captain that day, unless there was a very good reason. Then, one such reason lifted his head behind Ko's shoulder and misread the moment, eyes coming alive in that exact way. Observation catches 1/2 breath too soon. To be a surprise, he lunged with a hook. Ko did not turn. She flicked a finger and let a bite of Conquerors nip him on the calves. He stumbled and stayed alive, which told Naruto everything he needed to know about the way she spent loyalty. Naruto met the lunge anyway, because leaving it unanswered would have unbalanced the bridge's story. Armament hummed into his palm. The hook kissed it and apologized with a spark. Ko sighed, but her mouth smiled, because the boy knew how to be strong without being loud. They didn't try to take the bridge by force. They tried to tax it. Ko spoke like a ledger delivered by wind, proposing percentages wrapped in politeness, and backed by the simple fact that her crew could close water in any direction faster than the land of waves could march law onto the span. Naruto listened and let observation sketch the shape her words made in the men behind her. Some were in love with the idea of order that pays for itself. Some had come from coasts where the only law you meet is the one you bring on your back. He told her no with an honesty that did not sting, because it was aimed only in one direction. This belongs to people who chose it together. And Ko changed weight across her feet, the way a sailor shifts ballast when a storm-strength breath tries the sails. Then we test it, builder's son, she said, eyes flicking to Tazuna and back, and the skiffs began to move like fingers probing a seam. It became a siege without walls. Boats darted, ropes snapped toward pylons, hooks kissed stone and looked for purchase. Shinobi moved like good punctuation, commas where pace needed to catch, periods where a sentence of violence tried to run on, exclamation points when a boy with more will than sense needed to be discouraged quickly. Naruto stretched observation across the span until each breath became a dot on a grid he could slide. He watched panic look for a home and denied it a lease with 2 words or a touch at the shoulder. He coated the bridge's base with armament where the ropes bit, making stone less friendly. Sparks fell into water and turned into steam like small insults. When the pressure built, when 100 small choices threatened to add up to more than his people could sort, he let conquerors out in a line that ran rail to rail. It didn't knock anyone down who didn't already want an excuse to stop. It made eyes blink at the same time. Bought 3 heartbeats of sloppy in the enemy's footwork. Gave a fisherman with a hammer the courage to smash a hook without worrying about the man at the other end. The cost answered like a bill slid across the table. His fingers wrote their shaking onto the stone when he braced. An electric hiss ate the top of his hearing, so Ko's voice shaved off sibilance. He accepted the price and rationed the spending, folding his pressure back in like a sailor shortens sail in gusts rather than riding them until masts complain. Ko stepped onto the rail and breathed the river. She didn't dare a mass push because she had brought people she wanted to bring home. She cut instead, carving moments out of the fight with a blade you couldn't see until armament told it to exist. Her conquerors purring at a pitch most men's nerves would hear as a dare. She watched Naruto move and adjusted her mathematics. She found out quickly that his observation caught decisions, not miracles. So she created accidents, skiffs bumping so that a pole slipped, a rope coiling unexpectedly under a shinobi's shoe. Not cheats, just the sea reminding land that water pretends cooperation only when it's bored. He learned to respect that lesson without pretending to like it. Twice, he had to choose between stopping a hook and stopping a heart. Both times he chose the heart, and then trusted his people to shout at stone harder than rope could. Slow-mo. A pole came spear fast at a child's back where the market crowd had nodded. Naruto stepped into the angle a heartbeat before it formed and hardened his forearm until the sound was a tiny bell rung clean. He looked up and met Ko's eyes in the space between moments. They both nodded, then went back to their work. It ended when the river flipped coin to wind and the skiffs felt it first. Ko whistled a command built to be obeyed on exhausted legs. Her people fell back with the kind of pride that spends itself on survival rather than on last stands. Naruto didn't chase. He glued his will to the bridge a moment longer and then let it go like a breath held too long. The tremor in his hands wrote itself as a line of ripples in a puddle near his feet. He looked at it and refused to hate it because it was a receipt for decisions he could live with. Consequence scoreboard. The bridge held, No civilian dead. 4 pirates fished out shivering and embarrassed. A lesson earned cheap. Injuries. 2 broken ribs among Konoha's shinobi. A sprained ankle for a merchant who tried to help and will be toasted for it for months. Naruto's tremor heavy. Hearing's top edge gone woolly for a day. Politics. The land of waves gains a reputation for being politely untaxable. Konoha's soft power grows where sails talk. Public mood. Fear translated into competence. The market charged extra for eels, and no one minded. Territory. New gouges in stone near the pylons. To be pointed at by children as proof that stories happened here. Keo didn't vanish. She came up onto the bridge after the boats had retreated to a polite distance, and stood where the wind made her coat snap just enough to be photogenic, if anyone had been painting. "We did not come to be villains," she said, and Naruto believed her even as he did not care in the calculus that mattered to bridges. He told her they could help build a customs house on the far shore and get paid for checking weights and catching liars instead of for making honest men. Choose between honor and bread. She laughed, not unkind. "You want to domesticate a storm," she said, then tilted her head and let observation graze his patience. "Maybe you can." She offered him her forearm, not in surrender, not in truce, but as a test of who would harden first. He coated his skin light with armament and touched. Sparks the size of pepper shook loose and died between them. He felt the old thrill that lives under rivalry and refuses to wear a uniform. "We'll talk again," she said, and stepped down into air like a woman with faith in the idea that the world will hold you if you keep your promise to stand. He stayed a week because leaving too fast after the first storm is how roofs blow off in the second. He learned to hear the bridge creak like a friend's knee. He taught Tazuna's grandson to feel for a pressure shift in a crowd with his shoulder rather than with his eyes, and to breathe through it instead of flinching, a small Haki a child can carry without wearing his heart out. At night he sat with Tazuna over tea that pretended to be stronger than it was, and they shared the comfortable silence of men who have both been saved by their own bad decisions and by other people's good ones. When he left, the bridge felt heavier underfoot, because gratitude weighs as much as stone if you let it. Back in Konoha, the cost came due in quiet ways. He reached for a cup in the morning and had to watch his hand arrive rather than letting it go on habit. The static at the edge of his hearing made the first few minutes of each day feel like he'd slept next to cicadas. Sakura scolded him without raising her voice and taught him to work with what his body now did. The way a callus forces a new grip becomes a new skill instead of a flaw if you name it correctly. He trained observation on small, harmless things as penance in practice. When a cat would decide to knock over a vase, when a kettle would pick the exact moment to simmer that would most annoy Kakashi, when a toddler's wail would turn into a laugh without intervention if given one more second of air. He found that the more he used this sense on ordinary life, the less it cost when he had to stretch it hard. Perhaps will, like muscle, benefited from walking as much as from lifting boulders. Armament became a meditation too. He learned to coat chopsticks until his fingers' dance wrote less onto them, to hold a brush steady enough to write characters that did not shame the paper, to lift a sleeping friend without waking them because the weight he added with his will could counter the tremors' tiny betrayals. Conquerors he kept in its sheath unless a room tried to become a mob, or unless a child needed to see what calm looked like from the inside. He slept better, which is its own kind of battlefield victory. News came like weather again, because a world learning a new language sends forecasts and rumors. Sails with black edging had been seen far north, where cold bites harder than conscience. A village west had made a deal with a crew that sounded like Kaio's but smelled like someone else's greed when the coins were counted. The sea daimyo had sent polite notes to inland lords asking whether river taxes might be a discussion worth having at a neutral island with good food, all courtesy paid, of course. The elders fussed and produced scrolls that had never been near salt. Naruto volunteered without being asked, because neutral islands have a way of becoming battlegrounds if nobody brings a story strong enough to keep the tables upright. He packed lightly. Extra patience, snacks, a coil of rope, because rope solves more problems than jutsu at sea, and left early enough that he could choose to arrive hungry, which makes negotiations honest. The island wore hospitality like a sword in a silk sheath. Pavilions faced the bay. Banners said names without committing to meanings. The air tasted like citrus and calculation. Kaio was there, coat thrown over a chair, as if she had promised herself to look less like a storm today. Ishiro leaned against a post, pretending he wasn't measuring distances. His eyes flicked to Naruto's hands and then to his ears with a sailor's quick inventory of a man's costs. Inland lords wore layered robes and the particular expression of people who had woken up late to a change and were trying not to look breathless. Naruto took a seat with his back to a wall and let observation breathe without being noisy. He watched deals try to happen and fail because their feet were pointed at old maps. He spoke when he was sure the room would listen, because the point was not to win an argument, but to choose a story that would survive weather. He talked about bridges and customs houses and the moral math of taxation that doesn't feel like theft, because people see what they get for what they give. He didn't use conquerors. He let the idea do the work and let his will ride it like a current. Kaio watched him with the interest of an artisan, watching a tool being used in a new way. The sea daimyo's envoy smiled with only half his mouth and made a note that meant either gratitude or a plan to stab someone later. Naruto's observation told him it could become the first if the room got to leave with dignity. It almost worked until a third crew, late and smelling like ambition, left too long in the sun, barged their skiff into the shallow water, their leader wearing armament like a crown. He announced taxes at sword point, an old joke told badly. The room lurched toward chaos because people were grateful for any excuse to do what they'd wanted to do all along. Naruto stood slowly because speed would have turned the air brittle. Cutaway. Outside, goals lifted, annoyed. Inside, he laid conquerors in a ribbon along the floorboards, so chairs didn't scrape and knees didn't knock, and men remembered they were more than animal. The raiders saw a feast and hesitated like dogs at a door where something larger breathed. He walked onto the sand and met their leader halfway, not for theatrics, but because distance is a weapon too. The man swung will like a club. Naruto parried with armament, drawn thin and strong, and answered with a palm that wrote regret into the raider's ribs and a quiet promise into the rest of his crew. This is not worth dying for. They believed him because he meant it. The leader tried for pride's sake. Naruto let him keep enough to leave standing. Kaio stepped up on his other side, weight shifting onto her back foot in a way that made the room conscious of how easily she could be the problem or the solution. Together, they ushered the interruption back to their boat with the sort of courtesy you remember later when you need a reason to call yourself a decent person. Consequences. Scoreboard. Parley. Preserved. A stupid fight denied oxygen. Injuries. One raider coughing like he'd swallowed his own mistake. Naruto's static worse for an hour and then settling like fog lifting. Politics. A fragile framework drawn over old rivers. Kaio marked as someone who can be invited into rooms without teeth showing. Public mood, cautious optimism with pockets of habitual suspicion. Territory, an island that could have become a graveyard, remained a place where good fruit tastes like agreements. On the way home, Naruto stopped at the cliff where the neutral island's grass gave up to rock and let his gaze reach toward horizons that would not fit in his skull, no matter how he squinted. Kurama uncoiled in his chest with the heavy cat ease of a creature that has nothing left to prove to itself. "You are leaking," Kurama rumbled, and Naruto laughed because it was true. His will, practiced and scarred, seeped into the air like heat off stone. "I'm sealing the leaks with better habits," he said, and the fox huffed what might have been approval, which is almost as good as love in a language as old as theirs. He sat there long enough for wind to change and for his observation to bring him the small, precise comfort of a fishing boat's predictable decision to turn for home because someone missed someone else on shore. He stored that in the part of himself that could spend it later when a room wanted to riot. Back in Konoha, the ramen steam curled like incense for a god who insists on being fed daily. Tochi slid a bowl his way with a nod that said, "We both know this has been a long road, and that you will walk longer ones, and that this broth is my contribution to your map." Naruto lifted chopsticks and watched the tremor, and did not hate it, because hate, like salt, is useful only in measured amounts. He ate and felt the village around him, breathe in a rhythm that his observation could stop counting now and just enjoy. Outside, a messenger ran past with a sealed scroll and laughter because not all news carries teeth. Somewhere far at sea, a ship turned its prow toward a place no shinobi map named. On its deck, a figure in a coat that had argued with every kind of weather looked inland and smiled like someone who has heard a new instrument join the band. Naruto paid, left too much because generosity is a superstition that works, and stepped into night that smelled like wet leaves and possibility. He didn't promise the future anything fancy. He promised to keep choosing in public what he practiced in private, to listen before he moved, to harden only what needed to carry weight, to never forget that making others kneel costs the kneeler something irretrievable. The stinger came gentle. A paper boat floated down the canal, candle-lit inside, circling once as if to bow before drifting toward the gate. He watched it go until the gold dot was eaten by dark, and knew, with the kind of certainty that does not shout, that the next story would arrive by water, and that he, hands imperfect and will scarred just right, would meet it where bridge and river shake hands. Word spread the way tide does. Quiet until your ankles are wet. The sea daimyo's envoy returned to Konoha with a scroll tied too neatly to be harmless, and an offer shaped like a puzzle. If the leaf could help chart safe lanes through waters near the ruins of the old whirlpool country, the envoy would lean his weight against the greedier captains and sell them on customs houses instead of knives. Naruto read the name Uzumaki written 3 ways, on the paper, in the envoy's eyes, when they glanced at his stomach without meaning to, and in the white noise that rose at the edge of his hearing whenever whirlpools were mentioned. He slept badly, dreaming in spirals, and woke with the decision already made. He would go, not as a savior, but as a witness who could turn a few levers if the room started lying to itself. He told Shikamaru with a shrug that put no weight on anyone else's day, and Shikamaru scratched his head like a man choosing between 2 equally inconvenient pieces on a board. "Bring back maps," he said, which was Nara for "be careful," and also for "I'm happy when the world grows in ways our enemies don't predict." They took a cutter whose planks sang when waves slapped them, a song in a language Naruto didn't know but enjoyed anyway. Keio's crew met them at an agreed speck of an island. No trees, only gulls and hot rock. And the way her people tied their boat to shore made Naruto feel like he was meeting a family that had counted a different set of stars, and yet ended up under the same sky. Ishiro nodded once, as if marking down that debts would be paid in clean coin and clearer favors. The sea beyond the island wore a bruised look. Currents tugged in arguments. Whitecaps wrote jagged notes too close together. "Old whirlpools don't sleep," Keio said, standing with her hands in her coat as if pockets could tell you more than eyes. "They remember cities. They want to spin something down to replace what they lost." Naruto stretched observation and felt the slope beneath the surface. The way water leaned toward a mouth that should not be hungry anymore. He tasted decisions in the swells like seasoning. Currents are choices, writ slow. He asked the sailors to show him how they read the change in wind that turned safe into stupid in a single breath. They did, glad to teach something the land hadn't bothered to learn. The first set piece arrived as a storm that chose punctuality over drama. Clouds stacked into a wall. Wind hid inside their sleeves and then popped out with sleight-of-hand delight. The first drops hit hard enough to make the deck talk back. Montage. Ropes uncoiled. Hands turned. Knots bit. Sails reefed until the canvas was tight as a promise. Naruto placed himself where foot traffic crossed. A human hinge who could turn to face anything. Observation painted the rain, not as chaos, but as a sheet music page. Patterns, stutters, crescendos. But it wasn't rain he cared about. It was fear. He laid his will across the ship like a blanket, just heavy enough to keep the wild edges from snagging. Men didn't kneel. They breathed. He took the helm when Keio tossed it to him without looking, and felt the ship like a stubborn horse. Smart. Skittish if you lied to it. Brave if you didn't. He hardened his hands with armament so the wheel wouldn't carve his palms open when it kicked. The lacquer of will turned splinters into slit grain under his grip. A wave came with a lip like a sneer. He met it square, so it could spend itself without stealing more than dignity. The mast moaned in a key that tickled the static in his ear. He grinned because it sounded like company. When panic tried to bloom, he pulsed Conquerors in the gentlest line he'd ever drawn, barely a hum that said, "Stand, don't scramble. We can pay this bill together." The cost nipped, finger sharper, the upper register of the world sanding itself down for a few breaths. But he kept the spending clean. Ishiro cursed happily when a sail caught right on a beat Naruto bought. Keio leaned into the wind with the angle of a woman arguing with a god she respects enough to answer politely. It broke as storms do, not with a bang, but with a peel, clouds opening like citrus, so the light came through in clean wedges. The sea rolled, muscle settling after a hard day. Consequences scoreboard. Storm ridden without lost lives. Ship's spine holds. Crew's confidence thickened in ways money can't buy. Injuries. Rope burn for 3. A split lip for Naruto where the wheel had reminded him not to be arrogant. His tremor a steady metronome afterward. Politics. Trust earned sideways between shinobi and sailors. Envoy's tidy scroll, now worth something edible. Public mood. Exhausted laughter. An appetite for stew. Territory. A new line penciled into the map. A safer lane that didn't exist yesterday. The ruins announced themselves as a mood more than as stone. The sea underfoot tugged in small, insistent circles, as if invisible hands were still turning a city's crank. Birds avoided the air over the center. Even light looked reluctant to cross it. Keio killed the sails and let the cutter drift on patience, while a skiff with a glass bottom window slung under its ribs swung out from the davits and kissed the water. Naruto and Keo climbed into it without speaking, because conversation would have to raise its voice here, and that seemed rude. Below, the world was a broken clock. Arches wrenched so their intentions were clear and sad. Mosaics turned to confetti that still remembered pictures. A bell lying on its side with crabs debating sermons from its rim. The Uzumaki script, stubborn and elegant, clung to stones like barnacles, refusing to vanish even when sea chewed it. He felt something like a hand on his head, not pushing down, just acknowledging. He let it. They weren't alone. Another pressure sat at the edge of his senses, lolling like a shark that has decided to accompany a boat out of boredom. When it moved, the water tightened in its face. The Baron of the Maelstrom arrived on a raft that had more ceremony than practicality. Planks lacquered, a throne bolted absurdly to wood, a canopy that meant to mock rain. He wore armament like ink spills across brown skin, and conquerors like a perfume he'd overdosed. His observation was lazy, but long. He had bought himself so many wins that he had forgotten how to listen when the world says, "Be careful." He smiled as if to say, "Welcome to my parish." "You brought land tricks to water," he called, voice carried in pieces by wind. "I bring water to land," Naruto said, and the Baron's grin flattened a centimeter. The Baron tried to steal the ruin the way a man steals a story, by telling it louder. He spread conquerors wide, sloppy theatrical. Skiffs rocked, knees flexed, sailors' grips went white. One man made the mistake of trying to breathe while the air around him wanted to be a fist. Naruto took a step sideways inside his head and framed the pressure rather than wrestling it. Instead of throwing his own will flat to cancel, he drew a narrow, strong line and laid it through the Baron's pulse at a cross grain. The effect was not spectacular. It was practical. Men blinked and remembered they had jobs. Keo barked 2 syllables that put 3 people where they belonged. Ishiro laughed to empty fear's pockets. The Baron's eyes narrowed because people not kneeling felt like insubordination, not just to him, but to the shape he believed the world should take. He leaned on armament and motioned, and underwater something obeyed. Moored chains tugged. A whirlpool licked its lip and grew. The raft stayed steady because it was center. Everything else circled toward obedience. Naruto dropped into work like a mason into mortar. Observation caught the cadence of the spin. Whirlpools have rhythms like drummers have favorite fills. He moved the skiff to slip into the offbeats, where water could be convinced rather than argued with. He coated a long rope with armament and had the sailors throw its ends around 2 ancient pylons that still stood like stubborn grandparents. Will lacquered the fibers until salt couldn't eat them this hour. Wide shot, the cutter heeled. Men ran along deck with feet finding lines they hadn't trod before. Keo perched on the rail with one boot pointed toward the Baron, as if to remind him that showmen trip when they bow too deeply. Naruto kept conquerors in his sheath until the panic across 3 boats threatened to sink, in a way that would make the whirl win by social physics alone. Then he let it out in pulses, not a flood. Thump, breathe. Thump, pull. Thump, tie. Beating time like a drum leader at the front of a marching line. The cost lit his hands from inside, nerves humming like bugs against glass. The static in his ears turned a shade brighter. He smiled anyway, because the beats landed, and men moved in that better rhythm, and the Baron frowned, not at him, but at losing the music. The Baron came personally when theatrics didn't work. He stepped off the throne as if the raft could not imagine an alternative and walked on the churn he had called up, boots lightly touched by armament so they didn't soak. He carried a staff that wanted to be a spear and an expression that wanted to be a lesson delivered to a disrespectful child. He swung will like a scythe. Naruto met him on the edge where deck met royal, feet planted where a different boy would have slipped. They traded stupidly simple strikes, because the point was to be where the other expected, and then do the thing underneath they were saving for when the audience got bored. Armament rang against armament with a tac-tac, like the world's cheapest metal. Sparks, tiny as grit, popping against skin. The Baron tried to flood Conquerors through Naruto like a river through a floodgate rusted open. Naruto accepted what he could counter without paying too much, then stepped aside and instead let his will press against the Baron's choices rather than against his pride. Choices can be bullied without honor. Pride bites when cornered. He used observation to catch the moment the Baron made a plan. Too complicated for his own muscles, 3 things at once in a body trained to do one thing perfectly. Naruto put his palm where the plan would kink and pressed. The Baron's knee dipped. He hid the stumble with a laugh that fooled nobody, whose living depended on feet. They moved to end it because prolonging a fight at sea is an invitation for the ocean to pick a winner both combatants would hate. Naruto spun a Rasengan small, compact, a moon pulled tight, and painted it in armament thin as shellac until it could scratch without shattering. He cut his conquerors into a line and pushed it into the Baron's attention like a wedge. Look here, not there. The Baron obliged in the way all proud men oblige when asked to consider their reflection mid-swing. The Rasengan kissed ribs where armament had been thick and was now careless. The spin tugged the habit open and wrote a bruise that would teach later. The Baron used the opening he'd created in his own plan to slam his staff into Naruto's shoulder with the kind of hurt that lives quiet and long. They both stepped back because honest pain returns dignity to posture. It should have ended with a toss into water and shouts, but the ruin below them wanted a line too. The old Uzumaki bell under the surface yawned as if waking and burped up a bubble of air from some stone lung. The whirl faltered, not from either man's will, but from history deciding to participate, and the Baron's raft tilted enough for him to look ungainly. Keio's whistle cut the air like cloth. Ropes flew. Ishiro leapt with a hook like a joke. The Baron found himself in an argument with gravity, while Naruto reminded the whirl who had named this place first by laying one palm to the deck and pushing armament through wood into water, hardening his refusal into substance. The spin coughed and then cleared its throat, deciding it liked this man's tone for the moment. The Baron calculated his dignity against the cost of a loss here, and chose to keep the accounts tidy. He retreated with insults caged in a grin. "You can't tax gravity," Naruto called, which was not clever but was satisfying. The Baron promised to return with better music. Consequent Scoreboard. World tamed for now. No ships swallowed. Baron's legend dented, and thus more dangerous. Injuries. Naruto's shoulder throbbing with a private drumbeat that would play for weeks. Hands humming. Static louder at night. 2 sailors bruised but gleeful. 1 rope chewed to threads and memorialized. Politics. Envoys offer. Graduates to policy draft. Keio's crew made into stakeholders rather than tolerated guests. Baron named aloud in rooms that had pretended not to know him. Public mood. Stories told have a new hero and a new villain, both specific, useful for communities. Territory. Safe lane inked. old bell mapped and made part of the local religion of caution. On the return sail, Naruto sat with his back against the mast and let the ship's small creaks argue him into sleep. Dreams swirled with spiral tiles, and a fox who didn't mind getting his paws wet. Ko sat near the prow and cut apples with a small knife, arm moving with the economy of someone who had learned to count calories the hard way. She looked at him with the pinch-eyed respect sailors give to men who have learned to be crew before trying to be captain. "You make kingship into a public utility," she said, not unkind, and he barked a laugh because the sentence tickled some part of his brain. Shikamaru had furnished over the years. "I make noise into a metronome," he said, and she flicked a slice at Ishiro, who caught it in his mouth without moving anything else. "Keep doing it," she said. "We'll sell it to fools as law." He nodded, because any plan that made fools pay for law was already better than most he'd heard. Back inland, the maps did work no speech could. Shikamaru spread them like bread dough and pushed ideas into shape with the heel of his palm. Tsunade, back in a chair she wore like armor and like a robe alternately, signed things while swearing at small type, and then, after the swearing, called in people who could make things exist where only stories had. Sakura set Naruto's shoulder with her mouth tight and her eyes forgiving. She put a hand to his hand and didn't pretend when she felt the tremor, which made him love the village more than ramen did for an entire day. Hinata watched him from a distance that was both kindness and pain. His observation brushed her intent and knew better than to pry, because some choices are earned in private and then brought to the table when cooked. He took turns walking the square where the crater used to be, letting children dare him to lose balance on lines drawn in chalk. They always won because he allowed the world to teach him grace. For a time, peace wore muddy boots and tracked light footprints through their days. Customs houses rose on piles like polite fortresses. Fishermen learned a new word, manifest, and filled it in with pride when they had nothing to hide. The Baron of the Maelstrom kept his teeth in, for now, and told stories that made him laugh louder than anyone else. Ko's crew cut a ribbon at a pier without laughing. Later that night, they laughed enough to crack the moon if laughter had weight. Naruto helped a man fix a pulley with armament instead of muscle, and learned that making your will heavy and useful could be an act of love. He caught a cup before it fell without using his hands, and decided not to tell anyone how much it had cost him to be casual. The point wasn't to be applauded, but to keep the cup intact. Of course, the world reached in with the kind of hand that knocks on a door and doesn't wait for you to answer. A convoy ran light in waters that used to be safe before maps were redrawn by people who had never been on a deck. Raiders replaced flags with tarps and hid under the skirts of islands until the last boat in line lagged in a way that wasn't entirely incompetence. When it went wrong, it did so with a speed that whitewashed the entire idea of time. Naruto met them halfway because he'd learned the paths the wind preferred. Ishiro was already cutting across the vanguard like a pen making edits to a bad paragraph. Ko timed a turn through a swell so clean Naruto wanted to clap. The raiders had a stranger on their stern, a boy with a grin built for posters. Conquerors poured out over his shoulders like oil. Observation quick but undisciplined. He was the future if nobody older taught him to bend, not break. Naruto saw himself sideways and stepped into the fight with a different plan than usual. He didn't throw pressure at the boy. He matched his breathing. He set his own conquerors low and steady, and let the boy's will lay across it like a restless animal, realizing the floor won't move no matter how hard you pace. The boy swung armament-coated chain in arcs that sang like cheap bells. Naruto met it with empty palm and timing rather than lacquer and force. The chain snarled itself around a cleat because he had taught its owner to look left too much. Slow-mo. The boy's eyes widened with embarrassment and relief. Naruto closed, touched his shoulder with armament so gentle it might have been a pat, and let observation write the next 3 seconds for the boy, like notes he could choose to play. The boy did, surprising himself and angering the men who had taught him to see mercy as jail. Ko handled those men with the professional courtesy one gives weeds that are easy to pull. Ishiro laughed and collected knives that had been about to be thrown. It ended without anyone proud of the day, but with nobody dead who didn't insist on the honor. Consequent scoreboard. Future Raider turned into future pilot. Convoy delivered. Raider crews scattered without a myth to hold them. Injuries, bruises and egos. Naruto static. A friendly hiss afterward. His shoulder sang but didn't sulk. Politics. Proof that law can be taught without a grave. Ko's reputation spreads as someone who chooses rooms over decks when it matters. Public mood. Merchants sleep with one eye closed instead of both. Children near the docks play at tax inspectors and pirates, which is hilarious to watch. Territory, another line on the sea, turned from a suggestion to a lane. The epilogue came on a day that devoted itself to being ordinary, and did so well enough to deserve a parade. Naruto sat on the Hokage monument again, when pretending to scold his hair. He held a letter from the sea daimyo that said nothing, and promised everything. Funds for schools and harbor towns, a blueprint for small ships that wouldn't drown their owners, and a seal that would make inland officials keep their eyebrows down when sea folk walked into ugly rooms. He tucked it away and watched clouds practice being mountains with less responsibility. Below, Konoha moved at the speed of people not currently in mourning. Somewhere, Shikamaru muttered at a cloud and decided it could live another day. Somewhere, Hinata placed a cup on a table with a gentleness Naruto's observation felt and refused to intrude upon. Somewhere, Sakura told a stubborn man to rest and then let him believe it had been his idea. From the direction of the coast, gulls wrote punctuation in the air and then flew inland like messengers who had cut class. A ship he did not know slid up the river that used to ignore ships. Small flags written in a language even his curiosity honored by not pretending to read. On its prow stood a figure with a coat that had forgotten how to be wet and a hat that made the horizon flatter when she tipped it. She stepped to the bow and stood with the easy balance of a person who had taught storms how to wait their turn. Her will pressed outward like a song played on an old instrument that had loved many hands. Naruto stood, and the tremor made itself known as always, and he didn't hide it. The figure on the prow saw it and smiled not with pity, but with recognition, as if to say that all decent crowns are dented. He lifted a hand in greeting, not summoning. She lifted hers, not saluting. Between them, the village and the river and the ocean held their breath and then exhaled together like friends about to become family. The follow-up didn't need a cliff or a promise. It had a river that knew its way to the sea, and a boy who had learned how to make will into a road other people could walk without paying with their knees. The figure on the prow climbed the river as if it had been made to carry her. Naruto met her on the rebuilt quay, where barges wore the fresh paint of ambition, and the air smelled like wet rope and steamed rice. Up close, she was older than his first guess, and younger than anyone who had outlived storms that long should look, while steady as a lighthouse beam that doesn't brag about saving ships. She spoke without ceremony and made sense like a knife you forget you're carrying because it fits your hand. There would be a convoy of purpose, halfway law, and halfway dare, to end the Baron's tithe by ending his deference to ruins. Ko stood to one side with her coat hooked behind a thumb, and the impatient patience of someone who had promised her crew she would bring them home. Ishiro watched the river's edge for the moment when water tells the truth. Naruto listened. His observation traced where these intentions would land if nobody lied or flinched, and the picture it drew in the air looked like a map children could color without touching the edges. He said yes because bridges keep their word, or they stop being bridges. Montage. They taught towns to move like crews, bucket lines that didn't tangle, knots that bit and let go when asked. Whistles that meant the same thing in 3 districts. They walked floodgates and greased hinges. Naruto's armament sliding into rusted pins so they freed without complaint. They tested sirens, not for fear, but for rhythm. Beaters and bells and hands clapping a code of stand fast, stand clear, stand together. Ko's people taught fishermen to read currents like they read their children's tempers. Shinobi learned to step where planks argued without stepping through. Naruto drilled his conquerors into a metronome, pulsed to the pace of men carrying crates and women hauling lines, and kids who wanted to help more than they could. The cost ticked in his fingers like rain on a tin roof. He slept knowing he'd have to count his breath the next day to stay even. The Baron arrived the way bad ideas do when they've been left unchecked, too loud, too confident. Wrapped in decoration he mistook for inevitability. His flotilla wore the ruins' colors like borrowed robes. Lacquer and bone and bells hung where they would be heard in rooms before the man wearing them entered. He'd brought allies from currents nobody charted yet. Men in tide-stained coats, whose armament sat on their skin like habits. Women with observation eyes that tracked 3 plans in a glance and missed the 4th because he demanded spectacle over sense. He came at dusk to make silhouettes flatter and fear fatter. The first move was not fire, it was theft. He leaned his will into the river's shoulder and told it to turn around. Water obeyed enough to cause heartbreak. Downstream, barges hiccuped where they should have glided. Upstream, ropes hummed as they bit back against new weight. Naruto felt it as a sigh underfoot, then as a shove, then as a slow hand on the village's throat. He stepped onto the eastern floodgate with his back to the city and his eyes on water that had forgotten its childhood. Wide shot, the river flexed broad as a street gone to muscle, light left in scraps and eddies. The Baron's flagship sat outside the worst of the churn, throne unbolted for this new sermon, staff planted into the deck like punctuation. Naruto exhaled to a 4 count and laid observation over the field until Panic's decisions drew themselves in ink he could erase and rewrite. He saw the moment a runner would slip and drop a latch. He made a boy tug that runner's sleeve. He saw where 2 barges would kiss and argue and become useless. He pointed, and Ko harpooned the taller one in the ribs with a line lacquered in armament and sang it sideways. He felt floodgate gears hesitate as if remembering a younger strength. He wrapped his palms in will and turned them, not like a hero proving something, but like a caretaker reminding a house of the name of each hinge. The teeth took and held. The river spat and learned a new route through the teeth of human intention. The Baron grew bored with the ship's vantage and chose to step onto the argument himself. He walked where water would bring him without taking his boots for a prize, armament sheathing soles and shins. Conquerors pushed in a sheet that wanted knees and got none. He smiled because his smile had closed doors most of his life. Land boy, he said, making it a title. Naruto didn't answer with words. He pulsed a narrow band of pressure across the floodgate to keep the men on it from adopting someone else's fear by accident, and saved sentences for when they could do work. The Baron twirled the staff once, and the whirlpools obeyed, like dogs allowed on furniture. The easternmost eddy fattened, looked like an open eye, and then rolled to stare at the floodgate as if it could be persuaded. Naruto met it with armament, not as armor, but as a shape. He laid his will over the water's lip and taught it an edge, gave it something to break around that wouldn't splinter and turn into shrapnel. The impact rang through bone and bank. The tremor in his fingers turned to the hum all the way to his forearms, his hearing's high end shaved away like the top of a mountain in cloud. He kept count in his chest. He moved only what needed moving. The Baron widened spectacle to swallow sense. He flung Conquerors broad, sloppy, loud. Civilians at railings bent and then straightened because Naruto's low hum had gotten into their spine earlier and stayed there as ballast. The Baron's observation finally sharpened on the boy who refused drama and adjusted. He called for skiffs to lunge at the boom lines upstream to fray them, and at the same time sent a wave to hammer the western gate where the carpenters were brave and under-practiced. Naruto's observation split, then braided. He threw a hand sign and a burst of bullet clones sprinted like sentence fragments to be made into sense by the right readers. He didn't fling Conquerors to all directions. He walked along the floodgate and spoke against a panic that had hardly arrived. He coated a Rasenshuriken with armament so thin it looked like shadow, and sent it sideways into the eddy, chewing at a pier. It carved a slot through water's habit, not war, and the whirl bit its tongue and slowed. The Baron saw his own reflection, not rising to the height he liked, and committed to turning the river's memory against it. He drove his staff deep and called the bell. The bell answered because history loves to be asked loudly. The coil under the ruins belched air and feeling. The old Uzumaki warding script along stone that nobody could reach flared with the dull, stubborn light of a lighthouse, whose oil has never once run dry. Naruto's breath caught, because that light knew his name in 3 ways he could not have taught it. The whirl sharpened, center cutting, edges singing. Keo shouted 2 names that meant grab and give, and threw Ishiro a line without looking. He caught it without moving his feet because that's who he was. Naruto stepped down off the gate and onto the ladder into the river's mouth, because sometimes bridges have to become boats. Slow-mo. He moved in the rhythm. Observation drew inside his eyelids, a map of currents and choices, breath and fear. He slid between 2 bulges of water that thought they were arms. He put a palm against a stone face no one had touched in a century, and laid armament into it until the grain of the rock leaned the way human hands want to lean when they help. He felt the cost ask for a larger bite. He let it take what he could spare, and nothing more. The world hummed in wool. He pushed, and the world took the hint from an ancestor written in his bones. The Baron met him at the ladder, bored with sermons, staff held horizontal, the expression of a man who remembers winning a race so vividly he assumes the track still owes him a ribbon. They traded what fight's like to pretend they are. Simple. Staff cracked, palm blocked, armament sang, observation corrected. The Baron tried 3 plans in a row that each would have won in a town that had never learned to drill. Naruto refused to let this be that town. He pulsed Conquerors once, not to crush, but to nudge a timing. Bargemen leaned when they would have braced. Sailors braced when they would have leaned. The Baron came close enough for Naruto to smell varnish over salt. Their wills touched like flint without looking for sparks, and found them anyway. Naruto cut his Rasengan small, spin high, will lacquer thin and sharp, and wrote it into the Baron's plan in the half-second observation, told him the man would pick pride over patience. It hit ribs where armament had been replaced by the lazy assumption that winning is the natural end state of a speech. The Baron grunted and hit it with a laugh that fooled no one in the habit of tying knots that hold in rain. The river chose to stay with its childhood and run downhill. Floodgates held, boom lines sang, skiffs kissed water with petulant slaps instead of triumphal ones. Ko took the western pier, back inch by inch with men who worked like a braid. Ishiro knocked 2 raiders into the drink and fished them out himself so they'd have to see his face later when they tried this again. The Baron looked at the ruin and saw it refusing to love him back. He changed the plan, not with grace, but with expedience. He blew his conquerors in a last broad sheet to cover retreat like smoke, barked orders, and swung a boot into his raft with less dignity than he had imagined in his earlier stories. Naruto considered a chase and felt his observation paint the costs. A woman slipping off a ladder, a gate tooth jamming, a rope parting with that ugly sound ropes make when they lose an argument. He let the Baron go not out of mercy, but because the ledger didn't justify the expenditure. He climbed back up the ladder, with hands that shook so finely the world looked like it was practicing breathing with him. Consequence of Scoreboard. River keeps its name. Konoha's new port remains a plan worth loving. The Baron leaves with a bruise that will teach if he's capable of lessons. Injuries. 3 broken fingers among gate crews who will be legends in their own streets. Ko's forearm cut where a hook lied about its angle. Naruto's hearing a low fog for a day, and his tremor drawn thick like a charcoal line. Politics. Customs houses become law with backers who were skeptics at breakfast. The Baron becomes an appointment the seed daimyo can no longer pretend is a rumor. Public mood. Terror alchemized into competence. Pride worn like a towel over the neck after hard work, not like a medal. Territory. Chisel marks on floodgate pins where will met rust. A bell underwater, made holy again by being understood rather than feared. They expected a duel at sea later, but the Baron was petty enough to come inland that night, thin and wet with anger, flanked by men who owed him more than money. He thought surprise would do what tide could not. He took the canal that spined the lower market and ran on the surface like a man who insists the floor should lift to meet him. Naruto met him on the stone, where lamplight cuts mostly shadow, and the smell is fish and spice and iron. The village did not panic. It folded itself out of the way with the practiced grace of a place that had drilled, but did not plan to use the drill. This was not a siege. This was a finishing conversation. 2 men owed to everyone who had built their days to accommodate their choices. They closed without speeches. The Baron's staff learned new decimals in the space between breaths. Naruto's armament layered over his skin so thin it was more promise than armor. Observation made angles simple without making them easy. Slow-mo. A sweep at knees. A block high when it needed to be low. A feint with the staff's butt. A palm heel to sternum that wrote a minute into the Baron's posture he would not get to spend. The man's conquerors came out a taste of copper and old fear. Naruto's answered like a taut muscle, refuses to tear. Firm, narrow, specific, just enough to hold a line so the room would stay a room and not become a stampede. The cost roared up his arms and took a bite at his eyes that turned the corners soft. He kept the mouthful he could live without and said no to the rest. The Baron forced a storm into a street and looked ridiculous. He called water from the canal into a twisting column with bubbles like hands. Naruto put his hand into it like a man testing soup and layered armament into the column until it found walls of will and broke its ankles trying to run. The collapse drenched everyone who had been polite enough to watch from doorways. Laughter snuck in where fear had tried to rent a room. The Baron's eyes showed the crack that comes when a story a man has told himself too many times fails to rhyme with the next line. He made one last choice, like a gambler. Double or nothing. He dropped his staff and reached for Naruto's throat with both hands, armament flaring. Conqueror's trying to convince Blood to forget which way to go. Naruto let the grab land and used the contact to write a different sentence. Observation folding a small precise pause into the man's wrist, then hardening his own will under skin until every finger felt like a bar over a window that had already been bricked up. He leaned in enough for the Baron to smell ramen and smoke and river and said nothing, because nothing was the only honorable word left. The Baron's hands faltered because they had nothing to close on, but someone who would not be closed. Naruto set a Rasengan the size of a plum just below the sternum and pressed. It spun a moral into flesh. You don't get to own other people's breath. The man folded. He didn't shatter, and he didn't bleed in operatic spurts. He sat down hard and looked at the canal as if it could still audition for the role of ally. Konoha didn't cheer. It exhaled. Keo stepped out of shadow where she had been waiting to shepherd civilians if the room lied to physics and tossed a rope coiled with casual intimacy. Ishiro tied it without asking for hero permission. They hauled the Baron like a net full of bad luck. Naruto stood with his hands shaking so plainly, even pride couldn't pretend it was the wind. He did not raise them to claim anything. He put them on his knees, bent, and breathed, because that is what you do when you've used more of yourself than is polite. Consequences Scoreboard. Baron captured alive. Konoha's lower market holds its shape and its humor. No torch lit where one might have. Injuries, bruised egos, bruised sternum on a man who deserved worse and got exactly enough. Naruto's tremors set like weather and bones. High sounds muted for a week. One lantern cracked and replaced before dawn. Politics. Trial at sea arranged by people who used to think trials were what storms do. Keo and the envoy named chairs of a council nobody would have believed was possible a year ago. Public mood. Relief so tired it forgot to party. Respect thickened, not the loud kind. Territory. A canal remembered how to behave in a street, and the street remembered it could host a storm and not drown. Days ankle walked into weeks, and the world did what it does when you stop watching it for a second. It found new ways to be kind to itself. The customs houses learned to be boring, which is their highest form. Fines got paid with eye rolls and jokes rather than fists. The sea daimyo sent a carpenter with more skill than patience to build a bell tower that could be seen from the outer shoals. And he and Tazuna argued about grain and wind, and both were right. The lettered folk scribbled names on new maps with ugly handwriting and clean intent. Naruto taught a class on the square about how to breathe when a room tries to turn you into a smaller version of yourself. The sign said, Posture Clinic, because people prefer practical words when learning holy things. He used observation on kittens and drunks and bureaucrats and found it cost less when used on creatures who already intended to be themselves. Armament became a way to carry children too sleepy to make it from stall to door without waking them. Conquerors stayed sheathed, except when a landlord tried to make someone kneel with a contract, in which case the pressure of a room remembering its own dignity proved a better ink than Tsunede's signature. They took the Baron down river on a barge with no throne and no canopy. He looked at water like a widower. He said little. Keo walked beside him with the fed-up tenderness one brings to someone who could have been better and chose not to be. Ishiro flipped a coin the entire way and never caught it once, letting it thud back into his palm as a metronome for days that had gone out of rhythm too long. At the mouth, a cluster of ships waited, flags arranged like polite teeth. The trial moved like a market, bartering facts for agreements, swapping insults for jokes, ending with a price everyone could say aloud without choking. The Baron got a cell with a view of the sea and work that would make his hands useless for tyrant habits, mending nets ripped by storms he couldn't command. He laughed once, like someone surprised to find breath in a place he'd assumed would be a tomb. Naruto didn't go aboard for the verdict. He stood on the quay and listened to the gulls coordinate and decided the sound counted as applause for someone else's turn. Epilogue came without theater, the way real things do. A class of kids in the harbor quarter learned knots and taxes and the difference between a law you follow because it is just and a law you fight because it is not. They argued with the elegance of people who will be better than their teachers. A bell tower's first ring cut through fog one morning and made fishermen cry without embarrassment. Keo brought a ledger as a gift and a grin as a habit, and told Naruto she'd be stealing 2 shinobi to teach on her decks for a season, because bridges that don't walk away sometimes forget the world isn't always coming to them. He shrugged and made certain she asked the shinobi first. Hinata placed a cup of tea in his shaky hand and saw without intrusion how he indexed day against cost. He thanked her with a look that wrote a paragraph and a bow that signed it. Sakura invented a splint for pride that let injured men help anyway without making their wounds worse. Kakashi pretended to read and actually watched kids take turns, which is reading of a kind. Tsunade swore at a ledger and then smiled at a number and then swore again to keep balance in the room. On a warm night that tasted of grilled fish and ink drying and the particular sweetness of a market that sold out of everything it meant to sell, Naruto climbed the Hokage monument with hands that trembled as they always would now, and didn't mind, because the city below made trembling a communal verb. He sat and let his observation blur until it wasn't work, only love. He named his 3 mechanics in his head the way a craftsman honors tools when hanging them up, listening wide enough to catch choices before they harden, hardening himself just enough to carry what cannot be dropped, pressing his will only where it keeps others standing rather than puts them on knees. He named the cost, too, and didn't romanticize it. A shake that would ride with him to old age, sounds missing in the corners of rooms, days when the world's edges would fuzz unless he breathed and let them return in their own time. He would pay it again. He wouldn't pay more than he had to. That discipline was its own power now. A paper boat drifted around the bend in the canal below, candle lit inside, its flame steady in a way that suggested someone with careful hands had placed it in water while saying a name. It circled once, twice, as if not wanting to leave, then found the seaman current that would carry it to the gate. The wind shifted and brought the smell of salt and pine at once. From the dark of the river, a small skiff nosed into view. A child at the bow pointing at the bell tower and laughing, because bells make jokes in air if you listen. On his lap, a letter from the neutral island lay opened, new charts to add to maps, a request for 2 carpenters who knew both floodgates and temple doors, a sketch of a school by the sea where land and water would teach each other manners. He folded the page and slid it into his frog wallet next to a coin Ko had pressed into his palm, with a smirk and a promise to argue soon. He stood, hands unsteady, heart steady, will quiet in the way of a drumline that has learned to keep perfect time without needing to be heard to be felt. Below, Konoha breathed in its new language, bridges that reached both land and water, markets that understood storm math, children who played at law and rescue instead of only at war. Somewhere far out, a ship changed tack toward inland, not because it had to, but because it wanted to see what kind of city teaches its heroes to listen. He smiled like a man who knows the sequel isn't a cliff anymore. It's a road with milestones and places to eat. He climbed down and joined the line at Ichiraku, paid too much on purpose, and ate with a joy that makes taxes moral. When he left, he took the long way home past the canal, keeping pace with the paper boat until the candle guttered at the gate and the dark accepted it without offense. In that unceremonious ending lived the follow-up's promise. Not a crisis to be manufactured, but a port to be built, a school to be opened, a bell to be rung, and a boy who had learned to make will into something other people could stand on without paying with their knees.